Last speaker is Roger Harris. Now, Roger has an extensive history and experience working in the forest sector. He has very much first-hand experience as well of what can happen in forest-related accidents. And since 2006, probably more importantly for us today, he's also been the BC Forest Safety Ombudsman. So please join me in welcoming Roger.
All right, well, thanks for the invitation to be here today. My topic is a little bit different. So the Forest Ombudsman role is for those that aren't aware, you have a BC Forest Safety Ombudsman that works in the industry collectively, and I get involved in helping to resolve issues, but at times the BC Forest Safety Council has given the position a fair bit of flexibility, and that flexibility allows me at times to take issues and look at them in a more generic global concept. And one of the reports that I did, this was released, I believe, early 2017 or the end of 2016, was on helicopter emergency medical services, which normally, if I was in a room in northern BC in a small community, tends to leave the audience reasonably enraged. And if you do come from a small town, and you'll see that as you go, it really points out some glaring differences between living in a rural environment and an urban environment. I think it's important. But maybe more importantly, this report has got a lot of traction, which you're always glad when you put something out that does, and still has the ear of government, including the new government and the old one. In fact, I'll be briefing the new government's caucus later on this month, and I've met with some of the ministers. So at the end of the day, although the role drives from the workplace, why this particular topic, I think, has got so much traffic, I guess, is because it also has a strong appeal if you live in a rural community. The challenge that most rural communities have today is, quite bluntly, they're shrinking. Nothing's really changed around that. And the way they start to reverse that is they need the ability to attract investment jobs, people to come into their communities. And if you're going to go move somewhere, whether you're an employer or an employee, you know, you look at sort of three basic things, of which healthcare is one, probably education, recreation. And if those sort of buttons don't get ticked off, you decide I'm not going to go live in Fort St. James or Hazelton or Iskut or one of those sort of spots. So this is a topic. So maybe one more piece of background, and I promise you one thing else. In the spirit of getting you out of here by 4, I'll move quickly through this set of a dozen slides or so, and I won't talk about the fullness of the report, but I will talk quick and you can listen fast. So the history of this is what makes someone like me decide to look into it was there was a faller named Esco who was working up in Haida Gwaii, an isolated camp. He sustained an injury while falling to his leg. The crew got him out onto the landing. They quickly could see that his leg was in serious distress. They called for emergency response. They were told something would come shortly. They waited about an hour to realize at this point in time nothing was coming. So they took him down to the crew boat and they put him in the crew boat. I don't know how many of you have been up in Haida Gwaii. I lived there for 20 years, which is a nice spot. They took him over to South Moresby Camp. It's about a 15, 20-minute crew boat ride. They got him there and called again for the helicopter to come and get him. Nothing came. So they finally stuck him in the donkey doctor's truck and started to head down the road. South Moresby Camp is an old Crown Zellerback license, hasn't been operated on for probably 20 years, not in any sustained way. So it's one hell of a mother of a road if you want to talk about a bouncy place. But they get about halfway towards a town called Sandspit, and they do run into the ambulance. So the ambulance attendants take him out of the donkey doctor's truck. They look at the leg and they can see it's pulseless, and they immediately get on the phone and say, you need to send a helicopter. He has a pulseless leg. To which they're told, we're not sending any helicopter, take him to the hospital. So of course that requires you to drive to Alfred Bay and wait for the ferry to come, of course, because good news, it's on time. Gets you over to the other side in Charlotte City, gets you into the hospital in Charlotte City where they look at it and they go, it's a pulseless leg. This is in serious trouble. So we better get him back in the ambulance and we'll drive him back down to the ferry terminal, catch the next ferry, and get him back over to Sandspit Airport where he'll get on a fixed wing system and fly him down. The long story that was a long version of a short story, is that he lost his leg. And that story, when you start to get into these sort of things, becomes very, very, very commonplace once you get out of the world of about small communities. So I can't see what I'm looking at here, not really. What is this? This is advanced. Oh, okay, look at that. What about technology? How do you make this thing move, though? There we go. Oh, it comes up nicely. So what is helicopter emergency response? This basically is it. It's its definition. You'd like to be Mike. It's basically ambulance services in BC. But in BC, what makes us unique is helicopter emergency response, which most of you would think is when you heard a great presentation on the last folks on the driving where they talk about some pretty traumatic accidents. And most of us would think, well, those are the ones that you sell helicopters to. Well, if you live in Tsawwassen, that's probably going to happen, but not if you live anywhere else. In fact, it's policy that you don't send them. And in BC, if you go on the website, you see Heli4 does most of that. And the role in BC they're served for is to transport people from hospital to hospital. They're very, very, very rarely used to attend accident scenes. As you can imagine, gotta get my technology going here. So this map sort of tells you already where this presentation's going. This is a little bit of a comparison of what emergency response looks like in our neighboring province of Alberta once you get out, and these are advanced life support units and access to helicopter. The sign on the other side would be the province of BC that don't recognize it. And you can see that it looks a lot different in terms of access. This is just another map of the same thing, but it actually puts into numbers and context the actual number of available units that you can get, so if you do have an incident or an accident, helicopters will come to it. So in the report, because I do want to get through this quickly, the report actually looks at a number of things that, not just the transportation itself, but in fact how you do it. In BC, we use long lining. Long lining is the people are outside of a helicopter suspended. In most of the world, they use hoisting, where you're inside the helicopter. There's a significant difference in time in terms of how long it takes you to get to a hospital or not, which usually dictates the outcome between long lining. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those differences. I'm going to talk just basically about the service. So in the report, if you get a chance and you're eager and you want some, I'll try this one more time. The report has, when you're an ombudsman and you write reports, you try not to do a lot of recommendations, because I think if you get too many, they just get lost. So this report has about 4 or 5 what I call observations, and I'm going to talk about those. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 recommendations and how I look at dealing with the outcomes of this. This, to me, is the most important observation that I came up with. There's actually absolutely no barriers. We don't have a shortage of helicopters in the province of BC. Go to Fort St. John's. Bob Quinn. Anyone know where Bob Quinn is? That was one of the busiest helicopter airports in the province of BC. It's way up by Iskut. I mean, we have helicopters all over this province, every little town, every small town. We have first aid attendants. We have fabulously trained rescue and fire departments everywhere with a set of skill sets that are second to none. We don't have a shortage or the inability to deliver a service. It's a choice. It's a choice not to do it. And that's a really important piece, because I think one of the things you always need to deal with is it's a much different equation if the answer to this is you don't actually have the ability to deliver good services. Okay. So the first observation, because my eyesight ain't as good as yours, this is a reasonably important concept. And so the concept is that, and I think we'd all agree, that the sooner you get medical health care, the shorter your time of healing, and so your time in the healthcare system is significantly reduced. So, and I consider the time in the healthcare system to be not just the time you get hurt and you go see the doctor, but the rehab until you get back to that normal course of action. I think we can all assume that the shorter that time is, the less expensive it is to the system, and the more you can do. The problem is, in the province of BC, when we look at time, we look at that time from the moment you go see the doctor to the day you go back to whatever is. I'd suggest that the time that you enter the healthcare system is the moment you pick up the phone and dial 911. Because that critical time between when you first call for assistance and when you finally get to that next elevated level of healthcare is so critical to what happens going forward after that. if ASCO had been sent a helicopter, which was sitting on the ground in Prince Rupert, which was less than 45 minutes to get him there and had him in a hospital, he would probably have his leg today. No different than the faller in Port McNeill, who was ambulanced to the hospital in Port McNeill. I lived there too, by the way. And there they decided that he needed trauma services. But rather than fly him to Nanaimo or Victoria, they put him back in an ambulance because the policy is you don't do that in BC. And drove him down to Campbell River, where they looked at him again and said, no, he needs trauma services. Stuck him back in the ambulance again. Took him just under 20 hours from the point of accident to when he got into Victoria. He lost his leg too. And these sort of stories go over. So I think that's an important observation, because if we can assume that that's where you want to go, then you realize that that's really what you're trying to do. This is all about time. It's all about how you can get someone. And although this role looks at the workplace, why this becomes so important. And I think one of the real challenges we have in BC is that if you're an employer here and you are in a remote or isolated place, part of your emergency response plan is to provide transportation. So you may in fact have some combination of people you phone to make sure there is an ambulance or a helicopter available if you need it. But that service is not available to your kids who might be playing soccer in your town that weekend that happen to have an accident and have a compound fracture in their leg, because your employer isn't providing the helicopter for that. And if the infrastructure doesn't exist in your community to transport people, it's not going to happen. So that's the first critical point. Only because, again, the urban-rural divide is really, to me, what this is about, and it's what policy is. So recently, actually, it was interesting, the week I released this report, there was an incident on the beach in White Rock where a guy in an ultralight crashed it onto the beach. BC Ambulance Service, and this is not an exercise in beating up BC Ambulance Service, I'm just talking about how the process works, dispatched both a helicopter and a land-based ambulance to attend to that scene. Because down there, in a concentrated area where the population is, that's where they concentrate all their assets. And so that guy had two methods of transportation arrive. If that guy had an ultralight in Smithers, or if he'd had it in Dease Lake, or if he'd had it in anywhere else, there isn't even the option provided to launch a helicopter. You're gonna get a land-based ambulance. There was a woman that had a stroke just north of Fort Nelson, Fort Liard. Stroke needs at least 3 hours. You got to get within a hospital in a 3-hour period to get that injection that gives you a chance of surviving. They sent out a land-based ambulance from Dawson Creek because that's the policy. So it's 10 hours to get there. They had to stop for lunch and to fuel up going back. So, I mean, these stories are not few and far between. They're actually just the way your system runs. That's what it is. So there's a tremendous split in how the rural and the urban viewscape is seen in terms of how emergency services delivers services in the province of BC. The other observation, only because my memory's not great, I think this is a really important piece. So if you look at the Alberta model, I showed the map earlier, and you actually get outside of BC, a lot of them are private delivery. So I think in Alberta it's Red Stars. I actually think in BC, I'm not a big fan that that it should be a privatized model. I think there is a role for government that's really important, because it doesn't mean that every helicopter that's in the ambulance or the emergency helicopter evacuation business needs to be owned by the government, but it does need to have a core base of services located geographically to make sure that we've got the province covered. There's one point I missed about the urban-rural split, which fits into this. I think all of us generally, we may not like it if you live in a small community, but I think we can accept the premise that you can't have a hospital in every community. And that's mainly because there's just not enough doctors probably to go around. But I think the premise that's, if you're talking about equitable healthcare access as opposed to equal, then to me, as your infrastructure goes down in terms of the physical asset you have in your small community, then it would seem to me your ability to transport people to get them to the place where they need to be should be enhanced. So if you get into a Dease Lake as an example, they're probably going to have a small clinic. They should probably have a much more advanced evacuation transportation system. In fact, in BC, it goes in the opposite direction. The lower your physical assets, the less transportation options you have. You don't have paramedics. You don't get the access to the same paramedic services. You don't get the access to helicopter transportation. You don't get access to anything. And to me, that's a really critical component of creating a province where we provide equitable health care. And it's a really important distinction. I think this is the last bullet on the observations. And this is the other one. The protocols, we have a province that looks at the whole world the same. In one way, I'm saying we don't give the same service outside of it, but in other ways, we do tend to look at it all the same. So the same kind of protocols, when you're looking at how you're going to treat different regions of the province, we live in a fabulous province that has tremendous climatic geography differences from one end to the other. I'm going to Fort St. John again next week, and they still got about anyone from here over there, there's still snow up there. I mean, in Terrace, there's still snow if you get into the bush. You know, in here, quite frankly, I was bragging how nice the weather is today. So, I mean, you can't have one standard of everything everywhere. So one of the interesting things about the helicopter in Prince Rupert that belongs to the BC Ambulance Service is it's on wheels. I don't know how many of you, like I do, that live in rural communities, but we don't tend to have helicopters on wheels. We put them on skids because you put it on a wheel and you can completely constrain where you can actually send that thing. So anyway, because I'm near the end of my time and I don't want to run over, out of this, I came up with 3 recommendations because I think this is sort of the heart of the report. And if you're bored one night, feel free to read it. The first one is, in this province today, there's no threshold. There is no timeline. So if one of us actually collapses here and an ambulance comes, there's no actual requirement that says we have to be to the hospital in 5 minutes or an hour, or 2 hours, a day. If you have no thresholds and no targets, then you have nothing to measure yourself against. And if you start looking at our neighbors, and I looked in the report at Washington and Alaska only because they're similar geography to us, those jurisdictions, and quite often a lot of jurisdictions in Canada and in the world, set a standard. And the standard would be, in Washington State, it's 97% of the population has to be within 60 minutes of a trauma-free center, period. That means that those people that deliver ambulance transportation services, that's the part of it, set up their infrastructure so there's 93% of the population upon call get an asset there that gets them in front of the right health care at the right time. I think that is the most critically key important recommendation in the report. If we don't have any guidelines, no thresholds, and if you don't, you gotta legislate this stuff. Because if you don't, we're always just trying to continue to put a round peg in a square hole. The second recommendation I looked at deals with the human resource. So if you're going to actually start to make sure you can deliver the service, one of the criticisms may be you don't have a human resource. We have a fabulous human resource in this province in terms of emergency services. If you pick up the phone for a 911, you're getting 2 responders, except if you live in Kitimat, for a different reason. But you're going to get the fire department attend with their emergency response people, and you get the BC Ambulance Service attend. Every small community in this province has fire departments that have fabulously trained people. We have search and rescue groups that still, again, have those same skill sets. We have legislation in the province that says it's illegal for them to transport somebody to a hospital. If we're going to expand and create access and opportunity to people in every community, we need to start to take advantage of the human assets we have and start to make the changes that actually make those things, start to use the skill sets that these folks have. And if it requires a little training, well, so we do that. But we have the assets. To that slide I showed at the beginning, there's really no barriers except ones we created for ourselves. And I think in some cases, in many, they're artificial. And maybe the last bullet, because I'm not covering them all, deals with the how services are delivered generally, and it deals, actually the other one, this deals with hoisting. The other one deals with geography. A lot of the legislation around how services are delivered in BC were drafted back in 1970, 1980. This is 2017, 18, going to be 19, and healthcare is delivered a lot different today. We now have health authorities and everything else, and as I said earlier, in this province we have a system where we sort of look at the world as one. There probably, I don't think, we don't have, so I'm going to back up it. When you go to a small town, we don't have a provincial police force. We don't have a provincial fire department, but we do have a provincial ambulance service. We didn't used to. I'm not suggesting at all we should be going back to community-based ambulance services. But I do think there's a role now that we have health authorities that recognize the geography of where they live and have a responsibility to the citizens that live in there, so Northern Health Authority is responsible to the north, you got the Interior Health here, that those folks should have some role in at least defining, designing, or putting in place the equipment they need to service the clients that live in their geographic region. To me, that makes a lot more sense and starts to put, you don't have the same, if you live in Vancouver Island, you don't need the same thing as what you need if you live in Fort St. John or if you live in the Kootenays versus Terrace. And I think that there needs to be a role, and all of these are sort of government, most of these are government functions and regulations that need to change. So that's kind of it. The last one deals with hoisting, and I'll come on hoisting, I'll keep it short because you actually have a couple of good outfits in this part of the world that do hoist. There were a lot of examples that came to me during this when I did the research on it and the interviews of people that had situations where you were, there's nothing worse living in Smithers, having an accident where a helicopter comes and takes you off a hillside and puts you on a road so you can be loaded into a land-based ambulance that then drives for an hour back to the hospital while the helicopter in 12 minutes flies back to the same spot and passes you on the way. There's nothing worse than getting plucked off of one helicopter to be put into another. And so, we do have, this is all about time. And the one thing that hoisting does, and the difference between hoisting and long lining, is that with a long line, you're lifted off a hillside, you're put on the ground, and then you're put in a land-based ambulance. In a hoisting scenario, which is what's done in most of the world, by the way, you can land your emergency responders right on top of the accident scene. There's no need to, and then you can bring the patient up, put them in the helicopter, and you just go straight to the hospital. Because this is all about the clock. And that's how you get better health care. And for me, what the report, obviously, as you can tell by my bias, shows a very unbalanced and unequitable system that we have in the province, and that's it. I'm done.